All right, welcome back to the Onebar and Lupagus show. I'm Onebar with Lupagus and special guest draft analyst Ryan Roberts over from A to Z Sports Film Room. Well, the links will be down in the description. I just soaked in his hour-long live, him and Jody, a good friend of the show. It's fantastic. They're going to be live every Wednesday, noon Eastern. So get your butts over and check it out. But we're gonna pick Ryan's brain, a little draft style today.
Yeah, Ryan, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I do need to ask you guys who's your favorite draft analyst between me and Joe, though, real quick. I think before we move on here.
That's important. It's
no Kuiper.
100%. Easy. Joe always says, "Am I your favorite?" Because we always say our favorite draft guest. So Ryan, it's you, man.
Yeah,
Lupagus might think different.
No, I'm a big Ryan Roberts fan.
Number one. I'm gonna take.
I got a picture of him back here. You just can't see it.
Tattoo on his back. Yeah.
All right, Ryan. I want to talk about the Vikings. Okay, they've addressed a lot of needs here in free agency. Pick 24. They could go a ton of different ways. How about just some value guys that could be there at that spot? Pick 24 this first round.
I mean, I think if when you say the word value, right? Like value is a guy that maybe is a little bit of a luxury pick and maybe not the biggest need in the world. And like that for me, I've seen it in a couple mocks, and actually I just did it in my mock this week as well. Like I did a 3-rounder, and it was Nick Emenwari from South Carolina was the guy that I threw to them because originally I was like, that's a really interesting one because Harrison Smith's probably retiring this offseason. And I know he kind of made some people surprised that he decided to come back for another season, which is obviously great for the Vikings, Super Bowl hopes potentially this year. But I really do think that Nick Emenwari still at 24 would be an interesting play because you can come in, learn from Harrison Smith. You could still use him on the back end. You can use him on the second level at times. When you're in sub, you can utilize him all over the field. You can blitz him from different spots. You can play him on the second level. You can play against tight ends. I'm very interested in just kind of that player potentially because I think that he would be a perfect fit for that heir apparent for Harrison Smith, but still bring you value year one. So Nick Emenwari is like number one where I'm like, that would be fun. Otherwise, like, I feel like I've mocked a corner to Minnesota like 7 straight years and it hasn't necessarily worked out fully for Minnesota, but I do think there's a couple guys like if Siobhan Ravel out of ECU didn't get hurt this year in the midseason, I think we're probably talking about him as a top 15 pick right now, but the injury has kind of made him more like a back end of round 1, early second round type of conversation. But that kid is 6'1.5", 32 plus inch arms. He would have ran like 4.35 if he was able to test with the injury, and he probably would have jumped 40 plus inch vert. So I think a corner like a Ravel potentially in that slot for Minnesota, but I'm really enamored with the potential of Nick Emenwari at 24. I think that would be a really interesting fit.
Definitely name that's picking up steam in Viking circles.
You and Joe were having quite the conversation on your show about defensive tackles, the Walter Nolans, and there just seems to be a lot of I don't know what you call it. Not everybody seems to be on a different page when it comes to D tackles in this year's draft. Vikings addressed the defensive line in free agency, but still definitely a position they could look at. Like, is there, aside from Kenneth Grant, is there anybody that's just like, he's going to be damn good in the NFL? There's no question marks, whether it's Harmon, maybe it's even a guy in like the mid rounds. Is there just a guy you feel very, very good about aside from the big boys?
I mean, I'll throw 2 names out there. I mean, I think Derek Harmon's one. I think Harmon's versatility is so interesting because when he was at Michigan State, he played like mostly nose, like he was kind of a zero in Michigan State system. But then he goes out to Oregon and I mean, they run a lot of 3-man stuff. They run a lot of 4-man too. Like they're kind of a versatile front. I mean, he's playing anywhere from like a 0 to a 4-4-I at times, even a 5 in a couple instances, that although rare. So I think that versatility brings a very high floor to the table because he can do a lot of different things. The other one has kind of become a darling in draft circles is Darius Alexander out of Toledo. Like I just can't imagine him at least being just a solid to good rotational player at worst, right? And you're going to get him in the top 100. You're not going to get him in the first rounds because he's a little bit of an older prospect. He's a guy that is, unfortunately for him, in a really, really deep defensive tackle class. So like there's a possibility that you get him in the back end of the top 100 or at least back end of top 75, like somewhere in that ballpark. And I would just be very surprised if Darius Alexander wasn't at least a good player in the NFL. I think we have questions of like what the ceiling is comparative to some guys, but he brings a very high floor to the table, which is super interesting on day 2.
Let me piggyback quick on the D tackle. Walker out of Kentucky. What's your take on that guy? Every time I do a mock draft, I always have to take him in round 3 just because he's this big, beautiful man. But what's your take on where do you think he'll actually go?
He's probably one of the most divisive conversations in this class because, like, if you just isolate the talent, it's super exciting, right? He's over 6'7", although that is kind of his biggest detriment. He's 340 pounds, and he moves really well for his size, right? Like, there's a reason that he was the recruit that he was, and it was so shocking that he went to Kentucky just to begin with. But I thought 2023 there were a lot more pleasant signs. I was in the summer. Wasn't fully bought in, but I was very hopeful for the upside that he brought to the table. And then honestly, like, this past year just wasn't good. Like, it just wasn't. I mean, like, some games that he had on film this year were just like, guys, like, this is undraftable stuff. Like, his Ole Miss game, I think, was one where I was just like, this is really, really bad. Like, and when I say that, it's like, you're still going to take a dart throw on him because he's big and talented, right? But like, film wise, if I'm just grading off of like his Ole Miss game, it's like, man, I don't know if I would draft that kid. Like, that's a really, really ugly game. And now some things have come out talking about his back issue that he had this past year. I don't want to question that because it's coming directly from him, but that's the first time I've heard of that. And I did touch base with someone around the league that I know that also didn't have any knowledge of that. So like, there's a little bit of weirdness to that injury that has all of a sudden popped up. But here's the biggest thing. He's 6'7" plus. He plays with awful pad level, like awful. And he gets driven off the ball way too much for a guy that's 340 pounds. If you could promise me that he gets to a defensive line coach that can fix that flexibility somehow and gets the best version of him all the time, then he's a top 50 player, at least in this class. But the problem is that if he isn't, then he's a borderline rosterable player on the NFL level. So if I have to predict, though, I think someone will still take a top 100 swing on him just because he's so physically talented, but I don't think anybody that does so is going to feel super confident that it's going to work out. It is a little bit of a dart throw in the top 100 picks.
Who do you like better?
When I pick him in round 3, I won't be excited anymore. So the dream is over.
If you're projecting him or comparing him to T'Vondre Sweat last year, who would you rather have?
I would rather have T'Vondre Sweat, and I wasn't even a big Sweat guy, to be honest. Sweat even outplayed. He outplayed. He was way better this year than I thought he was going to be. Way better. The thing that he does have advantage of is he's not as so he's a guy that's going to have to eat up space like a Deion Walker is in theory. But the thing that Sweat has comparative to him is that Sweat is a much denser built and shorter player where leverage is not as much of an issue for him. That's the biggest thing with Deion Walker is that if he doesn't figure out if he doesn't figure out the lack of flexibility and just the general posture that he plays with, he's not going to be able to handle the point of attack. And you're not drafting a 340-pound guy to just rush the quarterback. That's not going to be his game on the next level. He's going to have to two gap at times. He's going to have to play at the point of attack. He's going to have to disengage blocks, and he just doesn't do that very well. So although I wasn't a big Sweat guy, I would much rather had him coming out of Texas than Deion Walker right now. And then obviously with the sample size I have now with Sweat, I mean, it's a no-brainer at this point right now.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned corner earlier to the Vikings. Let's say they don't address it in round 1. They have added some guys in free agency, Jeff Okudah yesterday, Javier Thomas, Isaiah Rodgers, but still a need they could address. If they wait till the end of round 3, they have pick 97. Who are some guys who could be on the board there?
Pick 97. I thought it would be Darian Porter would be a guy from Iowa State that would be potentially there, but he just ran out of the gym. So, I mean, there's a possibility that he ends up being a more top 64 level player. I think if we're talking at that spot, late day 2, I think Quincy Riley from Louisville could potentially be in play. He's a little bit of a shorter guy, but he can run for days. He was a track guy, track background coming out of high school. Not overly physical, but the kid can run. He has good hips. He's a really good just coverage specific player on the next level. I think a Denzel Burke from Ohio State could be in that range as well. He had a great 2023. 2024 was very up and down. He tested pretty well though, so I think there's still some athletic upside potentially there to get hopefully the more consistency out of him, because he's so weird because Denzel Ward 2022 film was bad, 2023 was excellent, and then 2024 was just up and down and sporadic. Like, it was very interesting. So it's like, I almost feel like saying, like, who is the real Denzel Burke? I'm not really sure exactly who he is because I've seen 3 different realities of Denzel Burke, but he's physical, he's scrappy, and he ran 4.46. So it's not like he's a non-explosive player. He has some upside there. So I think him back end of that spot would be an interesting player. I think Zy Alexander, if you're more of a zone exclusive team out of LSU, could be in that conversation as well. He's not a great athlete overall, but he has tremendous ball skills and he's a really good zone discipline player. So I think that those are a few guys that potentially be there at the back end of day two, excuse me.
Nice.
All right. Once again, we got Ryan Roberts, A to Z Sports, live every Wednesday on the show. Links will be down in the description. Hit them up. They do a mailbag, so you can throw all the most random questions you want over there. They'll answer them.
Stump them.
Yeah, stump them. Try to stump them. Benjamin Morrison, what's your thoughts on him? And our team scared off by that hip?
They are a little bit. Some are at least. I have such a weird relationship about Benjamin Morrison in that conversation point because obviously I cover Notre Dame a little bit for A to Z Sports too, and people hate that I'm lower on Benjamin Morrison comparative to people, and they just don't like that too much. I'm a hater apparently in like Notre Dame circles, but here's the thing about Benjamin. Benjamin is one of the most intelligent cover men in this class. Good change of direction. Understands and anticipates things breaking in front of him really well, and he played a lot of man coverage snaps during his career at Notre Dame. So like you look at him and say he can play some man, he has zone discipline as well, like he's a really smart player. It's like, okay, that's awesome, that's great stuff, and he has good ball skills. I mean, I think as a true freshman he had like 6 interceptions, and like he's a really talented cover man. The problem is very limited play strength. One of the biggest issues with him in 2023 was a lot of missed tackles, and I think there was just some general stuff in the air where he was out leveraged and just lacked physicality. So 2023 to 2024, that offseason, I'm like, okay, we have a lot of good here. If we can increase that play strength, then we're cooking, right? Like that's a first round player if that happens. Unfortunately, he hurt his shoulder before the 2024 season. He actually had shoulder surgery before that, and so at that point I was like, oh man, my biggest question was play strength, and he has a shoulder injury. Like that's not good. Like that's not a very good thing. And then ultimately he only played a couple games. I think he played like 4 games in total, and then he has the hip injury. And the problem with that is that like when we talk about corner evaluation, we always talk about hip fluidity, right? We always talk about change of direction. Well, I don't know how much it's going to affect him, to be honest, because you just don't hear about like hip injuries that much for corners just in general. Like it's kind of a little bit more of a rare injury in some instances. So I am generally a little bit terrified about this because I don't know the full answer. If you could tell me that Benjamin Morrison exactly who he was before injury, then I think you're going to get a top 50 value in this class because you think he could have been a first round pick if he was fully healthy. But in the fact that we're talking about a corner with a hip injury, that's scary to some folks. Now, the positives is that I have not heard any negative feedback from medical checks at this point. So it sounds like at least they're clearing him and that he'll be okay for the long term, or at least the short term, I should say. But I would be it's a risk to take a corner top 40 potentially that has a hip injury, right? That's coming off of that, because I think that is generally just, there's a damaged goods conversation that needs to happen at some point with some of these guys.
100%. Who are some of your favorite late round sleepers in this class?
Oh man. Favorite late round sleepers. I just was talking on that live that you were talking about, Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt, who's a running back out of Arizona that was a transfer from New Mexico. He's one of my favorite guys. I was expecting him to be a riser in this class. He was at New Mexico, and I loved his film at New Mexico. I thought he was dynamite. Transferred to Arizona, I'm like, yes, now we're going to get him on a bigger scale against better competition. And then he only played 1 game this past year because of some eligibility issue there. But he averaged 100 yards a game because he only played 1 football game, which is pretty hilarious. But Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt, I think, is a really interesting football player. I would say offensive line-wise, I've taken a liking to Jackson Slater out of Sacramento State, who's played mostly guard during his career at Sacramento State, although I think he can play center. So I think that he could potentially back up 3 different spots in his evaluation on the next level. And he went to the Senior Bowl. I thought he had a pretty good showing overall. Jalen Travis is a big offensive tackle out of Iowa State that was previously at Princeton. That is massive. I mean, he's like 6'7" and 340 pounds, but he's a pretty decent athlete overall. And if you want a guy that I think could swing at both different spots, playing both tackle spots, I think he's an interesting like 6th round value potentially on the next level. trying to think if there's anybody else that I want to hit on here. There's a lot. There's a lot of guys in this class, man.
I
This
can
is,
confirm you love that running back. I listened to you gush about him to
he's
Joe.
good, man. Oh man, I'm telling you, man, he may have been a top 150 kid if he didn't have that eligibility stuff. But he went to East West Shrine despite playing only one game, and he was like one of the big standouts of the week. So yeah, man, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt's one of my dudes in this class. Love that kid.
Hell yeah.
Who's gonna get overdrafted? Who's gonna go off the board and you're just gonna crap your pants? You're like, I can't believe this dude went that early.
It's probably Walter Nolan, to be honest.
Oh, I knew it.
Oh man, I really want to love Walter Nolan because I've said this before and I believe it. Like if you took just like the 10 or 15 best plays of Walter Nolan from 2024, you're like, damn, dude, that kid's good. And then you look at his like him comparing himself to Aaron Donald a few weeks ago, where you're like, okay, I can see it a little bit. All right, I got it. But the problem is that, and I just talked about this with Joe, it's like you play 70 snaps in a football game, though, right? You play 50 plus snaps in a football game. If 10 are great and the other 40 are not very good, it's like, and that's the biggest questions. And the questions that I heard from people in the league is that people question the motor consistently. They question if he plays hard all the time, but then there's other stuff off the field, which, and this goes back to high school and even his time at Texas A&M, where like people have questions about him being a great teammate and him being fully locked in and him having great practice habits and all these types of things. So I think that he's going to end up being a late first to early second round pick. I would not be shocked if he falls into the first round, but if a team like the San Francisco 49ers, for instance, who have a little bit of love for him, I think at like pick 11, if they draft him at 11, that's going to be very Javon Kinlaw type of selection, in my opinion, that I think we're going to look back on and be like, I'm not sure if I love that one long term, but we'll see.
All right. I want to get your thoughts on Tyler Booker, maybe his scheme versatility. There's a lot of who are saying he's not a great fit for the Viking scheme and potentially could be there at 24. We still could upgrade left guard. So Tyler Booker, what are your thoughts on him?
I think Tyler Booker is one of the cleanest evaluations of an offensive lineman in this class. Is he as dynamic of an athlete as some? No, he's not. And honestly, it was kind of weird. I expected him to run a little bit faster in the 40, maybe like 4.2. I mean, like 5.2 high, right? Like 5.27 or something compared to the 5.3, whatever he ran. But I don't think I was generally kind of confused by the perception of it. It was like people expected him to be like this dynamic elite athlete. I'm just like, was I watching the same film? Like he's a power dude. Like he's not a guy that's working in space a ton and a guy that's going to be in the screen game a lot and do all that type of stuff. So I just thought it was a little confused on just kind of the perception of Tyler Booker and his testing. It was exactly kind of what I expected, for the lack of, maybe a half a tenth of a second. Like it just wasn't anything appalling to me. But I do think that he is super physical, plays with good leverage at the point of attack, plays with strong hands at the point of attack. And I do think there's a misconception on his ability to as a diverse run blocker. Like most people just kind of look at his testing and go, and his style and go, that's a gap power guy, right? Like that's all he can do. He just needs to move at the point of attack. And I'm like, well, guys, in like an inside zone scheme, you're doubling and moving at the point of attack a lot, right? Like your ability to drive off the football is very, very important. So is he going to, like, if I had an outside zone heavy scheme, would I love Tyler Booker? No, I wouldn't love Tyler Booker, but if I'm an inside zone team or a gap team, I'm like, yeah, that guy can play for me and he could be a really good player overall. So I can say for certainty that there are a couple teams that I've talked to that have Tyler Booker as their highest rated offensive lineman. Now he's a guard, so that doesn't mean that he'll go before some of the tackles off the board, but that does mean in a vacuum, teams really do like him. So I think he's going to end up being a back end of the first round kid, but I do think that he is going to be just a good starter in the NFL, if not a plus starter in the NFL. And a team's just going to kind of forget that Tyler Booker's on their team for a little bit because it's just like he's just good, right? Like we get so bored of good offensive guards. You're just like, okay, nobody talks about you, but you're just good for a long time. I mean, it happens on almost every team. So I think he's a solid to plus starter in the NFL level, and some people have kind of just forgotten about that based upon his testing not being great.
Well, it's been a long time since we've had a good guard, so we don't know what that feels like.
Good. He doesn't have to be flashy. He can just be good. He'd be just fine.
Hey, that one guy for you guys had a good like 4 or 5 games to start the year, right? And then he
Randall, yeah. Then Darrisaw went out. Then his true colors showed.
True colors. Yep, they did. All right, Ryan. Before we let you go, I want to throw in one more. Center wise, so the Vikings signed Ryan Kelly. Obviously, he is no spring chicken. Is there any center in the round 3 to round 5 that you could potentially see as a pretty damn good starter given a year on the old bench?
Jared Wilson would have been that guy, but I think he's just kind of steadily rising because there's always going to be demand at a position, and unfortunately for some teams, the demand of him is going to be super high because he's the best center in this class, and I don't even think it's particularly close at this point, unless a team views like Gray Zabel as a center, which some teams do. But for a true center that no doubt is going to be a center on the next level, a lot of teams love Jared Wilson. So he might end up being a little bit higher than round 3, maybe back into round 2 type of player. We'll see ultimately where he lands. But if he's available, that's a perfect kid. I mean, he's pretty dense and physical, but he also has good movement skills. I mean, he ran 4.84 at the combine, which is super impressive, obviously, for a 300-pound offensive lineman. So he's a very talented kid. I do think one of the values in this class was, and it's funny, I was part of the people that made fun of Seth McLaughlin when Ohio State picked him up from Alabama because of the snapping issues. But I actually went back and watched his film last summer before the season started. And I actually kind of liked Seth McLaughlin. I had a draftable grade on him at that point, but he was a completely different player at Ohio State than he was at Alabama before he got injured. If he did not get hurt, I think he's probably a top 100 pick. He got hurt. So if we're talking about value, you might be able to get him in the 4th to 5th round at this point. And I do think that he is a potential starting center long-term. But if you're especially talking about a guy that can learn under someone for a year and get his footing, he is coming off of obviously that mid-season injury that is going to cost him a little bit of, or the entirety of this draft process. And we'll see when he comes back during the offseason. But I think Seth McLaughlin would be an interesting long-term investment for a team that can be patient with the center.
Nice. All right. Final. Gut feeling. Vikings stick and pick at 24, or are they trading down?
I think a lot of teams are going to want to trade down because there's just not a lot of separation. I mean, most people have said like pick 30 to like 65, 70. It's a lot of players that are very similarly ranked. Now that's a little bit of hyperbolic, but like it's not fully hyperbolic, right? So there is some truth to that. So I'll say that they trade back because I think that the one things the Vikings have done really well this year is that they hit free agency hard and they found a lot of value in free agency as well. Like it wasn't all just super top end names. It was a lot of like, wow, that guy's good. And you just got him for a very very easy value at that point. So I don't think they're desperate for a need, which is kind of what I'm saying here. There's obviously guys that you can still find, but I'm going to say that they trade back and they try to find extra value because I think that this class has been kind of, I think it's been inconsistently labeled a little bit this year. It is not top heavy. There's only about 9 or 10 true first rounders in this class, but the depth of this class is pretty decent. Like it's pretty good, especially on day 2. Like there's a lot of value in this class because we're on the tail end of the COVID year, which means that this is a bigger class, just generally speaking, like from a pure volume perspective. So I think if you could trade back at the end of the first round and get maybe a couple day 2 picks or another day 2 pick and then an early day 3 pick, I think that there's a lot of value to find in this class. So I'll say the Vikings trade back.
Nice.
Boom. Music to our ears. There you have it, Ryan Roberts, A to Z Sports. Like I said, links will be down in the description. Ryan, we appreciate you hopping on, man. You are clearly much smarter than us, and this was wonderful.
You're our new favorite draft analyst.
You're our favorite draft analyst, Ryan Roberts. I messed up.
I appreciate it. Well, if I started spewing everything that we just talked about to my wife, I don't think she would call me smart. She would just call me very niche. But I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming on.